Hello everybody. So one of the big news stories going around at the moment is that Victoria and its Premier Daniel Andrews has decided to cancel the 2026 Commonwealth Games that was going to be held in regional Victoria, not just Melbourne. In fact, it wasn't even going to be held in Melbourne, it was going to be held in some of the regional areas. And so that's a big news story because a lot of people are saying that will mean the end of the Commonwealth Games. So I wanted to assess that, have a look at it, and tell you what I think about all that. So the first thing to note, the Commonwealth Games is a Tier 2 sporting event. It's still fairly serious, but if we consider Tier 1 to be the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games offers similar sports, or pretty much the same sports with one or two exceptions, and it is at a lower level. And though not every country participates, and in fact some of the major countries that dominate the Olympics are not in it. So USA is not in it, China's not in it. They're probably the two big countries. All the countries that are participating are not significant in most Olympics. So Australia, Great Britain divides itself into each individual area. So you have England separate to Wales, to Scotland, to Ireland. And I think Northern Ireland is separate again. So they have 5 different groups instead of one. And then you have Canada. Again, Canada's not a major sporting country in, well, not overall, perhaps in some sports, and so forth. So it is probably at a similar level to other Tier 2 events. So just to understand this, so Olympics is the Tier 1 most important sporting event for most sports. Probably say half, 2/3, maybe 3/4 of sport. That's the most important sporting event. But it's not for all sports. So for example, for association football, called either soccer or football, depending on where you live, that is their major event is the World Cup. It's held every 4 years. The Olympics is not important for soccer fans. It's still fairly important, but it's not as important. For tennis, they have their 4 Grand Slams. So Australian Open, French Open, Wimbledon, and the US Open. They do have tennis at the Olympics, but it's not a major event. Basketball actually cares more about their leagues than about the Olympics. So if you have the NBL, I think it's NBL, finals in USA, that's a bigger deal than the Olympics. Because USA is always going to win the Olympics. In basketball, they've got professionals. It's not really a very close contest. But we don't know which one of their individual clubs is going to win their championships. Baseball, they have the World Series, which is really just USA. And that's more important than the Olympics. So the Olympics is not the pinnacle for every sport, but it is for most sports. And of course, then we have winter sports, and you have the Winter Olympics. So Commonwealth Games is not number one for anything. So there is no sport in which the Commonwealth Games is Tier 1. But it is Tier 2 for most things. Now you do have World Championships for a lot of sports. That's quite important. You do have sports in which they have Olympics and then they have a World Cup or World Championships and then they have the Commonwealth Games below that. But one of the advantages of having the Commonwealth Games is that it is multiple sports. And it's not even multiple related sports. They're completely unrelated to each other. And what, of course, the same as with the Olympics, you have one host city. So some of the World Cups will be held in multiple cities, such as, for example, in cricket, when they have a World Cup, which in some ways is the pinnacle for cricket, it's sort of a bit debated, they'll often have it in multiple cities and maybe even in multiple countries in some cases. For example, Australia and New Zealand hosted some of the World Cups, and you might have India and Pakistan and maybe even Sri Lanka and Bangladesh as well. So you can have multiple countries, but you don't normally have that for the Olympics. The Olympics is usually just one city, and the reason is because then it's easy for everyone to get to. It's usually a big city, and then they put everything in that one spot, and they usually make a big loss. But then moving forward, people will go to that years later, and it's a bit of a tourist spot. So the 2000 Sydney Olympic Stadium is still a tourist spot to this day, 23 years later, for example. And of course, they make state-of-the-art sporting facilities that then they can use for other things. So the cost usually goes to the individual city. Now Commonwealth Games, again, it's a tier 2. It's probably verging on tier 3 even for some sports, but probably tier 2 overall. And so it's not really watched that much. People don't really bother to go to it. So it's sort of a bit of an afterthought. It's every second years, and it's sort of like, it's almost like a warm-up for the Olympics, or an afterthought of the Olympics. It's in between, and we know that this is your chance to win, particularly in sports which are dominated by the big countries like USA and China, and perhaps Russia. Although Russia were banned. I don't know what their current status is, but they're probably not a major country. Oh, they're still fairly major. But, you know, so they're not there, so you get to do fairly well. Probably not really relevant in swimming, but in a lot of sports like gymnastics, for example, where China dominates and China and USA dominate a lot, you suddenly find these other countries doing better. So you get a bit of a chance to shine. You would have finished 15th if the other countries were involved. Now you might be having a chance at gold medal. So there are some merits for it, but we all know that's more of a bit of a personal pride. We're not all that interested as spectators. Unless you're living in that city, you're probably not going to bother. Even if you were living in that city, you still might not bother. So what happened? 2022 was going to be held in Durban in South Africa. And then of course we had that global situation that YouTube won't let me talk about. And cost a lot of money for a lot of countries, and South Africa said, look, we've lost too much money from that, we can't afford it anymore. They pulled out. Now, Birmingham in England were going to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games, and they said, look, we'll do the 2022. No worries. They pushed it forward by 4 years, hosted it for apparently $1.6 billion. Again, I don't know if that's Australian dollars or American dollars or some other dollars, but that's what the price I've been told. And I don't remember it. I don't think I watched it, but it happened apparently. And now, then they said, well, Birmingham can't host it twice in a row, so who's going to host 2026? And apparently all the cities that were interested changed their mind. They said they couldn't afford it. So what happened was that Victoria put her hand up and said, look, we'll host it, but we want to do it in regional Victoria. Now I'm going to point out to you that that's a really bad idea. You know how I said how certain things like World Cups and all that might be held in multiple cities and even multiple countries, but they're in big cities. Well, sometimes they'll be small cities, but you know, they're not going to be having small little regional towns. Well, I suppose you still could. You could have it hosted in Melbourne, but then have a few little regional towns, have a few little events. Depending on what the event is, it might be reasonable. But they're having it not in Melbourne. They're banning Melbourne. And Melbourne, I've just got to highlight for people who aren't aware of what Melbourne's like. It considers itself to be the sporting capital of the world, not just of Australia. We have major sporting facilities all over the place, and they're used all the time. People really love their sport in Melbourne. So Melbourne could easily host an Olympics, let alone a Commonwealth Games, with a minimum of effort. And in fact, if you didn't want to have completely 100% state of the art, you could just turn up and just say, hey, just use the ones that are already there. And Sydney's still got the ones from the 2000 Olympics. I don't think they'd need that much of an upgrade. And Brisbane, I believe they hosted the 2014 Commonwealth Games. Someone might correct me if that's the wrong year. And they certainly, I think they did in 1986 as well. So they would have facilities. So Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney all should be able to do this without much effort. But making it regional Victoria is going to be expensive. Because what happens is you have areas that don't have very many sporting facilities that suddenly have to be upgraded. And of course you have all these unusual sports in the Commonwealth Games that we don't really play in Australia. And some of those places are going to have to build entire new facilities from scratch. Now that's reasonably easy to do in a place like Melbourne, but it's a lot harder to do in regional centres. So it becomes a lot more expensive. Then of course once the actual games are on, instead of having one Olympic or Commonwealth Games village, you're going to have them in different hubs. So you're going to have one for Ballarat, for whatever sports they're hosting, one for Bendigo, one for Geelong, and they're not near each other. It's not like you go, oh, well, there's Melbourne and then there's this other place and they have all these other places nearby. No, these are a long way from each other. These take all day driving to get from one to the other. And you couldn't go to more than two in the same day. They're too far from each other. So if you went, let's say you went from Geelong to Ballarat, that's an all day drive. And you couldn't then go from Ballarat to Bendigo as well on the same day. It'd take too long. So that's, you know, if you wanted to go to multiple events, bad luck. You're going to have to pick which event you like. And there are people that like to watch multiple events in the Olympics, Commonwealth Games. That's one of the advantages of it. And it's nice if you're in the same city, you can just catch a bus, you take an hour, half an hour, and you go from one to the other. But you won't be able to do that if it's in regional Victoria. You simply won't be able to do it. You'll have to pick, do you like cycling? All right, you go off to wherever's having cycling. And you like swimming, you go to that place. And sure, if the swimming place is finished, because swimming's usually held at a different time to running, you might be able to finish the swimming and then go to the running places. But you won't be able to go to 4 different ones in the same week or the same day. And the people in Geelong, as long as you'll be able to go without having to go a long way, yay, good on. But what if that's all hosting boxing and you like swimming? Well, it sucks to be you. You're going to have to go over to somewhere else. And that's the problem. It becomes expensive, it's inconvenient. And again, this is not like with cricket or soccer World Cups where they hold it in multiple cities, maybe even multiple countries, because you'd only go to one of the matches. You'd only go to the matches in your place, and they're all the same type of event. You'd be having people who would miss out because they're in the wrong area. And if you had it in Melbourne, sure, people in Geelong have to travel all the way to Melbourne, but they'd only have to do it. It's all in the same spot. I mean, if you had the Commonwealth Games, had the whole thing in Geelong, and Geelong's got a population of 1 million, potentially they could handle it. I think it's 1 million. Anyway, if you did that, okay, fair enough. But you're doing it in multiple places, and you're avoiding the one place, which is Melbourne, which could actually handle it. And it's going to put the costs up. You're going to have a lot of places that are going to have to be custom built. Because even though you have amazing big swimming pools in Melbourne, I don't know if you have them in Horsham or Geelong, probably not to that standard. So even the ones that you already have in Melbourne, you don't have in these regional areas. So you're going to have to build them. So it puts the costs up. And the costs are apparently $7 billion. Now a lot of people say, well, that's ridiculous. Why is it 4 or 5 times as much as it was in Birmingham? Well, I can bet you that Birmingham already had all those facilities. Maybe not to the standard required for Commonwealth Games, but they already would have had them to some lower standard. Just had to upgrade them a bit. If you had it in Melbourne, I bet you the cost would be a lot lower. And it's just impractical. It was a bad idea to have it in regional Victoria. Sure, it helps their tourism, and that's what you're thinking about. You're thinking, all right, we'll spend a bit of money and it'll help you guys further down the track. And it would have. Good for them. It would have been an awkward games, annoying for a lot of people, and extravagantly expensive. This is a bad idea. In fact, if you want to keep costs down, have it in the same city all the time. If we had it in 2026 in Birmingham, who had won the rights for the 2026 games, and they hosted in 2022, I bet you the cost would be minimal. It wouldn't be the 1.6 billion they spent in 22, it might be $500 million. It'll still be a bit, they've still got to upgrade it from whatever deterioration from 4 years earlier, but it would be cheap as anything. In fact, if you had it in the same city all the time, the costs would be minimal. Not only that, if you just rotated between, let's say, 5 cities around the world, and you picked the 5 that have the best facilities suitable for this, the costs would be a lot cheaper. You could have one place host it 4 in a row, and then you go to another one. That's very cheap. If you're worried about prices, costs, you do it that way. And the reason why we have it in so many different parts of the world now, and of course we do it for Olympic Games as well, not so much for World Cups. World Cups tend to be only in the top countries, but then again, you never know, they're not always. World Cup crickets, we just go around the same places all the time. But that's the thing, like the reason why we do it is to try to encourage the sport and try to encourage tourism, all that. But do tourists really care about Commonwealth Games? Do they? I'd say if we held them in England every year, we'd probably be okay with that. Hold them in the places that can handle it. I can guarantee you that Birmingham can handle it. If it's a choice of cancelling it altogether or saying, let's have it in Birmingham twice in a row, Birmingham will say, sure. Because the Commonwealth Games is based around England. Birmingham's England. Let them host it in 2026 if nobody else can handle it. Apparently everybody else has said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with it. And also, places like Brisbane and Sydney should have been able to handle it. And the other thing on top of this, why is it up to the Victorian state government to handle the costs? Shouldn't it be a nationwide thing? If we were holding the World Cup, I'm sure we'd have it around the whole country, then the federal government would handle it. And if costs are such an issue and individual cities can't handle it, why can't you all pool it together? Put in a bit of money from everybody. And you know, and the other thing is, if it's costing $7 billion, why are you wasting $7 billion on the Commonwealth Games? Do the Olympics cost that much? I don't know, but you know, if Birmingham can do it for 1.6, we should find a way to do it for 1.6. If you can't do that for regional Victoria, just do it in Melbourne. I can guarantee, well, I can't guarantee, but I can bet that it's a lot cheaper to do it in Melbourne. We already have most of the facilities for most of the sports. Maybe they need upgrading, but upgrading is a lot better, a lot cheaper than having it from scratch. We have a lot of big football areas. We have tennis arenas that are hosting Grand Slam events. Now we have the Australian Open in Melbourne. We have the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne. Granted that they're not going to have the Grand Prix at the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games, but yeah, we have these big sporting events all the time, and we have major world-class sporting facilities. They're not all. Might have to create a few things, but and sure, if you want to create a few things that we don't have in Melbourne, do them in regional areas, but have the basis in Melbourne. Put your costs down a lot. It just seems like a stupid thing, and I think we have to say, when they looked at this, they should have been able to see that this was a bad idea cost-wise. They should have been able to see. Maybe they couldn't see it was $7 billion, and maybe they weren't too precise with it. They should be able to see that this was going to be a bad idea, that it was a better idea to have it in Melbourne than in regional Victoria. And, you know, there's been a lot of issues surrounding that. And look, if Birmingham refused to host it for 2026, they say, look, we just hosted in 2022, don't want to bother. And if nobody else comes in, well, then they skip the Commonwealth Games. I mean, we have skipped Olympic Games and never skipped the Commonwealth Games. We skipped Olympic Games because of World War I and because of World War II. For whatever reason, we didn't skip Commonwealth Games in spite of World Wars. I don't think we did anyway. Maybe we did. But, you know, skip one. Because we've got to realise that we had that global situation that impoverished a lot of people. We also have the war in Ukraine, which I know it's supposed to be impoverishing Ukraine, which is not in the Commonwealth, and it's supposed to be that the sanctions are hurting Russia. We know that they're actually hurting Europe. They're not even hurting America that much. They're hurting Europe, they're hurting Commonwealth countries. We're the ones that are suffering. And so it's quite reasonable to think, well, we're the ones that are suffering more than anyone else because the sanctions are actually hurting us. Because we're reliant on Russia for so many things. I didn't realise we were, but apparently we were. So it's quite reasonable in a time like that we can't afford to have it. The other thing is, if we can't afford it that great, why can't we do it at a lower level? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if perhaps there's a safety issue or they don't want to have it poor quality venues. But, you know, like, I'm sure that the athletes wouldn't mind that much if instead of going to 300 different cities on a rotation, we had 5 cities. And we said, all right, these 5 are good enough for their facilities. They have enough money, they can host it all the time. The other cities don't have enough money, they can't do it. And you just have those 5 cities. And whichever cities those were, maybe in 5 different countries, maybe all in the same country, I'm sure we could cope. What was that guy doing? Just stopped. Anyway, so yeah, so we could cope with that. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, look, I think maybe someone else can come in. Birmingham could host it, or we could just miss out on 1 year. That's all we need to do. I don't think we need to cancel it, but you know, I still think it was very badly handled. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye now.